Welcome everybody to our last session together. I'm very excited today to take you to Portugal. So let us begin. Today we are traveling to a place that lies on the furthest point of Europe and which for many centuries was known as the end of the world, especially for Europeans. Beyond it, turning west from its 527-mile coastline, there was nothing. Not even islands. Furthermore, there are few re-entrants to the coastline, despite its long beaches, which limited the number of good ports to 3 or 4, as you can see from this 17th century map. Lashed by sea winds, which were frequently tempestuous, and possessing an extremely narrow continental shelf, the Portuguese coast did not seem favourable to maritime activities and enterprises. So Portugal, the edge of the world, or the world as it was known in medieval times. The physical location of Portugal did not seem designated to favour the development of progressive cultures and would account, over the long centuries, for the backwardness of many of its natural features. We also have our normal Dark Age invaders, Phoenicians, Greeks, Carthaginians, and then Romans. The Romans dominated and pacified the entire Iberian Peninsula, civilized its land, and created the administrative units from which emerged the Portuguese frontiers. The Romans established the basis of a harmonious economic system. They introduced forms of soil exploitation and adapted them to local conditions, originating the fragmentation of land holdings in the north and their concentration in the south. And more than anything else, they brought their language, which diversified into popular dialects. Afterwards, from 711 CE, came the Muslims. The Arabs and the Berbers from North Africa colonized vast sections of Portugal, especially in the south. It is interesting that the Islamic contribution is much more difficult to evaluate here than in Spain, not only because the Christian Reconquest started earlier, already from the 8th century, but because Christian Portugal endeavored to obliterate all traces of it. But Arabic weighs heavily upon the Portuguese language, spoken by the inhabitants of the Western Peninsula, especially during the Middle Ages. Let's just think for a moment how the Muslims affected Portugal. Well, definitely in artistic and architectural forms, such as interior decoration, the use of tiles, elaborate ceilings, and city plans. In the impulse given to navigation and naval techniques and the development of new types of ships capable of being maneuvered, fundamental factors in the future for Portuguese expansion. And in the custom of their daily life, in the very essence of being Portuguese, the fatalistic psychology, the love for poetry, the capacity for assimilation and adaptation. I would even argue that these two great empires, the Romans and then the Muslims, surpassed the Christians that was to follow them. But let us turn to the Reconquest, the Reconquista. The Christian Reconquest had started immediately in the 8th century. At this time, Portugal was still part of the Kingdom of Leon in Spain. The process was slow. In the year 938, the name Portugal, possibly meaning tranquil port, appeared for the first time as a separate entity. On the 8th of August 1064, after a grueling 6-month siege, the Muslim defenders of Coimbra surrendered to forces led by King Fernando I of Leon, Castile. Coimbra, that strategic riverbank city, was to become the first capital of Portugal from 1131 to 1255, and its capture marked a critical juncture in the long struggle between Christendom and Islam for possession of the Iberian Peninsula. In Portugal, the Reconquista came to an end with the fall of the last Muslim enclaves on the Algarve coast, as you see here, in 1250. And so Portugal, as an independent entity, is very much a product of the Reconquista, the Reconquest. It turns from being a small, embattled country under the authority of the neighbouring monarch of Leon Castile into an independent kingdom with stable borders that remain largely unchanged until the present day. Christianity was the official religion and still remains, Catholicism remains today, but the faith of 97% of its population. And it's in the 12th century that Portugal gets its own king. A papal bull, Manifestum probatum, meaning proven by clarity. And remember, the first three words of a papal bull always give its name to the bull for the future. It was issued on the 23rd of May, 1179, by Pope Alexander III, who formally recognizes in this bull Alfonso Enriquez, the cousin of Alfonso VIII, the King of Castile, as the ruler and the self-proclaimed King of Portugal, as a monarch of a sovereign realm of Portugal. And the delivery of Manifestum probatum marks a climax in the long campaign by the ruling House of Portugal to establish an authority independent of the neighbouring Spanish monarchs. You have been, it says, an intrepid destroyer of the enemies of the name of Christ and a diligent supporter of the Christian faith, the Pope approved, leaving to posterity a praiseworthy name and an example to imitate. Pope Alexander makes it clear in his endorsement that a major factor in his support for Afonso's royal pretensions was the Portuguese's leader's success as a warrior defending the frontier between Christendom and the Islamic world. What is less apparent, however, is the means by which the Portuguese ruling house was able to translate military success against Muslim forces into political independence from the Christian Spanish kingdoms to the east. A clue to where part of the answer might lie is in the nature of Manifestus probatum itself. The Pope Alexander was in a position to determine the status of a Portuguese ruler is a striking demonstration of the pervasive influence the papacy had come to exert in Europe. It's a bit like the calling of the First Crusade in 1095, which still baffles me. What made Pope Urban II have the right to demand much of Western Europe to leave their homes and to go and attack the Muslims in Jerusalem? Pope Alexander was clearly the leader of a reform-minded church eager to impose ecclesiastical conformity on Christian society and even to be the deciding factor in the creation of a new kingdom. Perhaps also circumstances was helped by the fact that Afonso Enriquez personified the cultural dichotomy of his society. He was the son of an Iberian princess, Infant Teresa, and an immigrant Latin Christian nobleman, Count Henry of Burgundy. So the monarchs of Portugal ruled from the establishment of the Kingdom of Portugal in the 12th century to the deposition of the Portuguese monarchy and creation of the Portuguese Republic with the 5th of October 1910 revolution. The monarchs of Portugal all came from a single ancestor, Afonso I of Portugal, but direct lines ended on 4 occasions. And this led to a variety of royal houses, but they all had Portuguese royal patronage. And here you see the 4 royal houses of Portugal. Notice the last one, the Braganza, because that's a name that we're going to refer back to later on tonight. For the next few centuries, the kings and their kingdom grew in power. Afonso III, from 1246 to 1279, conquered the Algarve and moves the capital of Portugal from Coimbra to Lisbon. The king also created the Portuguese Navy, which for us as Jewish scholars is obviously going to be relevant. In terms of the kingdom, we should probably divide the Christian community into 3. We have nobles and clergy, we have bourgeoisie, and we have people. A typical medieval feudal society. But what distinguished nobles and clergy, and this represents perhaps the authentic cleavage which separated them from the Third Estate, were their privileges. They paid no taxes, they received protection from above and assured rights over the masses. These increasingly powerful nobles are going to cause problems for our Jews in the 15th century. The bourgeoisie were men of letters, professors of the university, the notaries scattered about the country, the lawyers, the doctors, and the apothecaries. Drawn from the ranks of the people, but almost always privileged, these men were close to the nobility and the clergy, of which they were often members. The people, the lower classes, with no privileges and with the task of maintaining the other 2 orders by their works. So now let's turn to the Jewish presence and summarize their history. Who are the Portuguese Jews? Well, let's start by saying that it is difficult to see the historical Jews of Portugal as being any different from the Jews of Spain. This frustrating fact for scholars of Jewish history in Portugal is that we are missing information. When the Jews are forcibly converted to Christianity in 1496 and really finishing in 1497, King Manuel I ordered the seizure and confiscation of the entire inheritance left by the Jews, the synagogues, their sacred and other books, and religious articles. It can be assumed that at this time, the archives of the Jewish communities and their precious documents were also confiscated. King Manuel deprives us of our sources. In fact, nothing is known today of the fate of these documents, and it's up to the historian to use whatever other sources are left in the archives of the kingdom that might mention the Jews. So like the Jews of Spain, the Jews of Portugal consider themselves Sephardim. The Hebrew word Sfarad applies to all the Iberian Peninsula. The only way scholars know the difference between Spanish and Portuguese Jews is through their surnames, because they often took upon themselves the name of the cities in which they had lived. The first written documents mentioning the presence of Jews in the peninsula, and especially in the part that was to be separated geographically and politically to create Portugal, date from the 5th century. But there is one epitaph of Algarve which dates from the 4th century. Note the name Yechiel in Hebrew, and here, although the picture does not reveal, there is an image of a menorah. So with that, we move forward to the rule of the Visigothic Kings. In 585, the Visigothic king accepted Catholicism himself. And at that time, Jewish communities suffer moments of anti-Judaism, clearly welcoming the 8th century Arab invasions. And the Muslim rulers of Al-Andalus granted the Jewish minority the protected status of dhimmi, or people of the book, as they did elsewhere. By these rulings, Jews are allowed a measure of self-government under their own religious laws. individual Jews pursued artistic and literary excellence or filled high administrative offices in Muslim cities. What we know about Jews at this time is that they live in Porto, they live in Lisbon, and they live in Santarém, although their numbers are very small. But in order to look at our sophisticated Jews a little more clearly, we need to turn to the period of Portugal under the Christian kings. We will be looking at the Jews' relationship with the kings. We will be focusing on these court Jews, those Jews who live, stay, and travel with the king and served him personally. These court Jews included the chief rabbis of Portugal. We will also be studying the continuing flow of Spanish Jews who enter Portugal. What was the communal structures of the Jewish communities like? And finally, I will show you a few case studies of some of the most sophisticated Jews of medieval Portugal. When Alfonso I established the Portuguese monarchy, becoming its first king, there were already important Jewish communities in several cities that had existed for centuries. I've already mentioned Porto, Lisbon, and Santarém, but here we should also add Coimbra, where there is a prosperous Jewish quarter. One of the Jewish residents of Coimbra was even in a position to sell to Alfonso I the land on which the royal monastery of Santa Cruz was subsequently built. And this already indicates that Jews are going to be important to the kings, perhaps not surprisingly. And if the Portuguese kings treat the Jews favourably, then the Jews fare well. The medieval Portuguese kings call the Jews my Jews, meus Judeus. And this condition implies that the Jews and their possessions belong to the kings. The kings are particularly thinking about the wealthy Jews here, court Jews, who get chosen by the kings for their unique levels of skill. And these Jews were merchants and property owners in major cities, as well as taking on the roles of chief tax collectors for the king. And I sense the presence of these court Jews here so much more so than in Spain, and I think I put it down to the smaller size of the kingdom. In the Portuguese case in particular, we are looking at the presence of specific Jewish agents connected to the state of finance. The characteristic process of the age of monopolization of political power by the kings led the kings to become more and more dependent upon the Jews. Let me give you one example here. Yehuda Evan Manir. He serves King Fernando as the treasurer, and at the same time, he's also the chief rabbi. I'm going to talk about the position of the chief rabbis in a few moments. But this court Jew, Yehuda Evan Manir, receives houses in Lisbon from the king in 1375, and his wife, Reina, receives 2 houses in Lisbon in 1383. Yehuda was the richest Jew in the kingdom, and that was the main reason why he was appointed as being the finance minister of Portugal. And this closeness, this dependence of kings upon Jews and vice versa also allows a fascinating aspect of Jewish life in medieval Portugal. On the one hand, the Jewish communities are integrated into the city and municipal authorities, so that these authorities often come to consider Jews as bourgeois or citizens in their own right, or almost. On the other, as elsewhere with medieval Jewish communities are regulated by its own law, by rabbinical law, with regard to its internal relationships, and it very much constitutes this microcosm within the medieval city. And for the much of the later medieval centuries, the king is powerful enough to keep the church and its demands that the Jews be servile to Christians at bay. And I want you to think that the kings really continually defeat any ecclesiastical attempts to intervene against their Jews. And we need to appreciate that between the 12th and the 14th centuries, Jews in Portugal have a better time than all other places in Europe, where they are facing expulsion, ridiculous chimerical accusations such as blood libel and host desecration. And we think that the Jewish populations of Portugal reach about 40,000 by the beginning of the 14th century. In general, the king's policies towards the Jews is one of protection and one of patrimony. And the Jews show this almost, I would say, unheard of loyalty towards the kings. And I want to give you an example of this too. One senses this particularly in the work of Solomon ibn Verga, in his work Shevet Yehuda. Solomon was a Spanish historian, physician, and he wrote his work Shevet Yehuda around 1520. It is one of the most outstanding and popular Hebrew books of the 16th century, and particularly describes Jewish life in medieval Sfarad. And Ibn Verga has an almost obsessive need to never blame the Spanish or the Portuguese kings for their actions against the Jews. Ibn Verga never budges from this basic position. For example, never do we hear in the Shevet Yehuda, whether directly or by implication, that the expulsion of Spanish Jewry in 1492 was due to a fundamental change in attitude on the part of the crown. Instead, he blames the growth of religious fanaticism and popular hostility, both welling up to such a pitch that they could no longer be resisted. So let's now turn to our court Jews in Portugal who became chief rabbis. The Jewish communities themselves were tightly organized structures under the leadership of a chief rabbi or rabbi mor, chosen by the king. This was usually a lifetime position. A good term for those chief rabbis would be perhaps ministers of Jewish affairs. This shows how involved the monarchs were in the communities of the Jews. The chief rabbi has wide powers in areas that were not connected to the normal actions of a Talmudic leader. One of his most important tasks is to visit all the communities of the kingdom at least once a year. And during his visits, he would hear about all the problems the communities were facing. Underneath them were the Arabi menores, the lower rabbis, who were elected by the members of the communities themselves. And the Arabi mor also appointed 7 obidores, magistrates, with jurisdictions in the 7 districts into which the kingdom was divided. And these 7 regions in Portugal became known from about 1279 to 1325 as the 7 districts or the 7 rabbinates, Arabi menores. The Jewish magistrates help the chief rabbi administer justice to fellow Jews. Each of the Jewish communities had their own rabbi, their own shochet, their own leaders, and their own treasurers. So let's find something more about these rabbi mores. We have one as early as the reign of Afonso I, the first king of Portugal. Afonso appoints Yaish ibn Yahya, born around 1120 and died in 1196. He was the son of Rabbi Yahya ben Yahya, a famous rabbinic family at the time, and was living in Lisbon. Legend said that this family were descendants from the royal house of David. Yaish ibn Yahya was a scholar, a politician, and a rabbi, Not only is he appointed chief rabbi, but as the king's head courtier and treasurer and tax collector. And it seems that Ya'ish ibn Yahya even helps the king as a military leader in the king's war against the Muslims. He was responsible for the capture of Abydos, which is in the center of the country along the coast. And he receives much property, his own family crest, which were used by his descendants, who also distinguished themselves as scholars, high officers of the kingdom, and leaders of the Jewish community of Portugal. Having a powerful Jew is, of course, helpful. And it's not surprising then that the next king, Sancho I, appoints a relative of Ibn Ya'ish, his nephew, Yosef or Jose ben Yahya, as the new Rabbi More. Jewish chronicles report that he built a beautiful, impressive synagogue in the old Juderia of Lisbon, and this could have been its walls. Thomas Museum today's collection includes this stone plate from the Lisbon synagogue, dated 1307 and bearing a greeting inscription. Under Afonso III, the Rabbi More was entitled to use the royal arms on his seal with the following writing on it: the seal of the chief rabbi of Portugal. And apart from administrating justice, the Rabbi More was also in charge of protecting the Jews under his jurisdiction against local hostility. One more thing I want us to notice about this close relationship between monarch and Jews is that this allows for a continual admittance of Spanish Jews into the kingdom. So medieval kingship in Portugal allows Jews escaping from anti-Judaism in Spain to enter Portugal. In fact, there are 5 border points through which we know that Jews of Spain entered Portugal. And perhaps the most romantic one for me is number 5, Marveo. It's a particularly beautiful and tranquil place to visit. It has a small, rather insignificant bridge, as you see, that served in the medieval period as a border point. And when I stand there, I imagine thousands of Jews coming across this bridge from Spain into Portugal. There is even there still a medieval gatehouse with a plaque which memorializes those moments, referring here to 1496, to that moment when Jews are forcibly converted to Christianity in Portugal. But this was put up on the 500th anniversary of that. So when did the Spanish Jews start coming into Portugal? Well, in fact, we have 3 specific moments. 1148, when Spanish Jews hear that things are better under the Portuguese kings. 1391, that terrible moment in Spanish Jewish history where there are many massacres and riots, and forced baptism of Jews begins. So these Jews also are coming into Portugal at this time. And again, in 1492, with the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, they naturally come into Portugal because, as they see it, things are still okay in Portugal. And we estimate that if there were as many as 40,000 Jews living in Portugal at the beginning of 1300, the number doubled by 1490 because of the entrance of Spanish Jews into Portugal. Portugal becomes a sanctuary for Sephardi Jews. Why is Portugal so attractive to these Jews? Well, obviously, it's proximity. Anybody would prefer to walk across land to reach a new destination and not be subject to tempestuous seas. But also the similarity of language, of course, the cultural similarities. These are Sephardi Jews, the same customs. But also the support that Jews in general received from Portuguese Jewish community. So let's now look at the Jewish communal structures a little more closely. If we look at 14th century map of Portugal, we see many communities being established, and here I've listed 18 of them being established. These communities appear in the sources as al-fama or al-hama. The word comes, of course, from the Arabic and had been used as the name for the Jewish community under the Muslims. The Jewish communities of Portugal enjoy comprehensive self-rule in the areas of law, education, and family life. The internal administrative life of the communities was ruled by statutes issued by the Jews themselves. And the Jews call their neighborhoods juderias, as you see here. This was the same name in Spain, but not in Catalonia. And these neighborhoods need to be understood initially as areas where most of the Jews chose to live, to be near fellow Jews. And as opposed to Muslim neighborhoods, Jewish neighborhoods were generally located within the city walls. Sometimes there was more than one Jewish neighborhood in a city. For example, in Lisbon by the 14th century, there were 4 Jewish neighborhoods. By 1383, there are 31 juderias in various parts of the countries, as you see here. But in the 15th century, this number increased so rapidly to 100 juderias, or Jewish quarters, in different towns and cities, as a result of the many Spanish Jews who fled to Portugal from 1391 onwards. From the 15th century, these juderias would be locked at night. For example, if we go to Sintra, one can still see 2 gates of this quarter. Yet when I walked through the streets here, I imagined this quarter to be filled with court Jews, those that followed the king around. Here was the town where the king would always go in the summers due to its cooler climate and its good air across the mountains. What was life like, though, in the juderias? Well, here poorer Jews worked as craftsmen and appear to have been particularly active in weaving and tanning, in the clothing and leather trades, and in every branch of the metal industry, ranging from ordinary smiths to armourers and goldsmiths, and other Jews were also wax makers, oil makers, and honey makers. It's interesting to note that almost all the blacksmiths in Lisbon in the 14th century were either Jews or Muslims. Jews also worked as merchants and traders, even in the slave trade of Muslims. Inside the juderias, religious and administrative life developed in full autonomy with synagogues. And we do have 2 extant synagogues worth a visit still in Portugal from this period. The first is in Toma, right in the centre of Portugal. And here there is a well-preserved medieval synagogue. It was probably built between 1430 and 1460 by the city's then thriving Jewish community. And from its size, we can imagine the community numbering between 150 to 200 individuals, which was probably 30 to 40% of Toma's total population. There is nothing from the outside to suggest it is recognizable as a synagogue, and the current north-facing rectangular main entrance did not exist in the Middle Ages. Yet the Gothic pointed arch facing east towards Jerusalem used to be the main entrance. Inside the synagogue, the rectangular hall has 3 short naves divided by 4 columns, as you see, supporting the Gothic vaulting. Excavations in the synagogue, in the building next to the synagogue in 1985, revealed remnants of a mikveh. The building may have been abandoned from 1496, when the Jews were forcibly converted, until 1516, when a private individual purchased it, intending to convert it into Toma's prison. The building probably served as a prison from 1516 until the 1550s, But at the end of the 16th century or the beginning of the 17th century, the former synagogue becomes a Catholic chapel called the Ermita de San Bartolomeo, the Hermitage of St. Bartholomew, serving in this capacity until the 19th century. From the 19th century until 1920, when the Portuguese archaeologists first visited the building, it functioned as a hay barn and then as a wine and grocery warehouse. But it's not until 1921 that the Portuguese government classified the building as a national monument. The synagogue now houses the Abraham Zacuto Portuguese Jewish Museum. We also have a synagogue in Castelo de Vide, also central Portugal, but on the border with Spain. This synagogue was built sometime in the late 14th century. Written documents attest to the existence of Castelo de Vide's Jewish community and Jewish quarter throughout the 14th and 15th century. It's a small two-story building that was altered over time. It is orientated east-west, and ogival stone arches frame all the building doors. It seems that a mezuzah shape seems to be on the ground floor doors. Inside the building exists today a 15th century carved stone Torah ark that was rediscovered in 1972 during repairs to the exterior walls. And this design, take a look at this design, sort of two sections divided with some sort of shelf in the middle. We think that this could well be the standardized design for holy arks for Arone Kodesh in Portugal, because a later ark was found in Porto in 2006 by Father Jardim Moreira, who was turning this specific building into an old people's home. This building, from the discovery of the ark, was found to be used by secret Jews in the 16th century. And the existence of a secret synagogue exactly here was actually confirmed by the philosopher Emmanuel Alboad, who was born in Portugal in 1555. He describes in his work on nomology in Amsterdam in 1629, as this was the place that he actually went to pray when he was a child. He wrote, "As a child, I visited a synagogue in the third house along San Miguel Street, counting down from Our Lady of Victory Church." And that's exactly what you do when you go to visit this ark in the old people's home. This carved granite repository is about 5 feet tall, arched at the top and facing Jerusalem. So this gives us a sense of the activity of the Judarias. They also house, obviously, schools, Talmud Torah institutions. We know that there were yeshivas, both in Chaves in the extreme north and also in Lisbon. What about Jewish scholarship? Well, until the 15th century, we know very few learned scholars in Portugal. There were a number of sages from the Ibn Yechia, Shlomo from the Ibn Yechia family, Shlomo ben Yosef, Ibn Yechia from the 13th century, authored a commentary from the Talmud that was unfortunately lost. His son Yosef, at the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th century, was a poet and wrote rhyming commentaries on the Talmud, which unfortunately was burnt in a fire. Yosef was a student of the Rashba, Shlomo ben Aderet, and after his death, his rabbi wrote him a eulogy. The flourishing, though, of the Jews in Portugal, and particularly the community in Lisbon, happens in the 15th century, undoubtedly as a result of this incoming of Spanish Jews who've come to live in Portugal. In terms of culture and religion, this century was the most important one in the history of the Jews of Portugal. The list of rabbis, philosophers, poets, doctors, and scientists is impressive, making the Jews of Portugal the nation's most literate group, more literate than anyone else. The Jewish tradition of literary, scientific, and artistic education meant that many Jews were doctors, cartographers, mathematicians, astronomers, and played an important intellectual and even social role in the community. There were physicians, surgeons, doctors, and doctors who even specialized in eye ailments in Portugal, just as in the rest of Europe. In 1434, as you see here, for example, King Duarte enacted a charter of privileges for a certain Master Nissim, a Jew, quote, because we know for certain that he is a master in the art of the eyes and he is qualified and fit for that office by some cures which we have seen performed at his hands in our royal presence. And by the time of this charter, Nissim had the power to grant or deny the license of practicing medicine to all the future ophthalmologists in the country. I want us to look a little bit closer at these sophisticated Jews, if I may. It is clear that Portuguese Jews played important roles as advisors to famous explorers, such as Vasco da Gama on his travels to India from 1497. We also have in Portugal Abraham Zacuto, the Portuguese Jewish astronomer, astrologer, mathematician, rabbi, Kabbalist, and historian, all wrapped up in one person. Remember that in Portugal, astrology is connected with medicine and regarded indisputably as a science. Zacuto comes into Portugal as a result of the 1492 expulsions from Spain, where he had been a master at the University of Salamanca. He was immediately admitted into the court of King Juan II and helped prepare the voyage of Vasco da Gama to India. He improves the astrolabe, a 15th century gadget with a system of wheels, allowing mariners to calculate their position according to the stars and even to calculate the exact time. One of the best written works, or one of his best written works, is a description of the solar system, astronomical charts, a type of mariner's Bible known as the Almanac Perpetuum. It was written in Hebrew and Aramaic and was titled Chachibur HaGadol, the Great Essay. And in the introduction, astronomer Zacuto says that the work is harmonious with Judaic teachings. He wrote that since the ancient Talmudists had presented no prohibitions against making known the movements of the sun and moon, he could go ahead with his work. In 1481, Juan Celeo, the astronomer's colleague, was to translate the doctrinal exposition preceding the tables into Castilian Spanish. And a rare copy of the book is in the state archives of the town of Evora. And it was this almanac of sorts that Christopher Columbus, would take with him on his voyage. In his diary, Christopher Columbus writes how he and his men were saved from death during his first voyage. Knowing from the almanac of an approaching eclipse, he warns the leaders of a menacing tribe that his god would take away the moon. The natives retreated, seeing the eclipse as evidence of the intruder's most powerful deity. So Columbus's diary recounts the value of Zacuto's table to his voyage, and da Gama's voyage succeeded thanks to the improved copper astrolabe and the almanac tables. Zacuto's time in Portugal, though, was to be short. In 1497, after the Jews are forcibly converted in Portugal, he flees by ship, eventually reaching Tunis, where he continues his writing under the title of the Talmudist, Moises Al-Aqsa. Historians disagree as to the place of his death. Some say he died in Damascus, while others place him in Jerusalem. There is disagreement also on the year of his passing, which fell between 1510 and 1522. But today, he is recognized by scientists who have named a large crater in the moon discovered in the space explorations of the 20th century after him. So Zacuto is really one of our exemplar Sephardi Jews who comes to Portugal in 1492. Portugal, still in 1492, remains a place of refuge, still attractive to many Jews because of its proximity and its language, as well as the cultural similarities and the support Jews expect to get, as I mentioned before, from the established Jewish communities. And I think we should argue that Portugal's struggle for independence, its wars of expansion, and now, as we will see, its attempts at discovering new territories was determined in a large measure Portugal's attitudes towards its Jews. Here, in an age of discovery, which the 15th century turns into, in light of Portugal's expansion, means that Jews were invaluable. When Prince Henry, the Navigator, the third child of the Portuguese King John I, establishes the Maritime Academy at Sagres, the seaport located on the extreme southwesternmost tip of Portugal. To head this rather unique institution for training future navigators, Henry appoints Mestre Jaime, or Yehuda Cresques, who comes from Palma de Mallorca, the seat of nautical and cartographical knowledge for Spain, Portugal, and the known world. He is the son of Dom Abraham Cresques, during whose time the Jews of Barcelona were considered to be the most expert map makers, and among whom Abraham was considered the most distinguished. Yehuda Cresques brings together prominent geographers, astronomers, astrologers, and cartographers, and most of these men were Sephardi Jews. From them, the navigators learned about developments in course plotting, map reading, and to work with wind systems and ocean currents, as well as to use new tools and equipment. Another sophisticated Jew that we must celebrate in Portugal was, of course, the Ababa, the most colourful character of Portuguese Jewry. However, his moments of glory in Portugal were blurred, as it was for others in the 15th century, by the increasing pressure that Jews had to face due to the rise of the considerable burgher class in Portugal. By showering crown lands onto these men, Portuguese kings lost a significant part of their income and became more dependent on these nobles. And so began a new era when an increasing number of noblemen who were guided by this arbitrary, variable, and ramified system of being granted privileges and immunities. These men were just as dependent on the king as the Jews, and it is inevitable that they would be a thorn in the Jews' side. In fact, what happens is that the Jews have to deal with them, often making bad political choices, as did Isaac Abarbanel. But what is so incredible in my mind about the Abarbanel is that he did not act to defend the interest of the nobility or their feudal privileges. By leaning towards the nobility, the Abarbanel had eyes only for the favours and rewards that he hoped he might bestow upon the Jews to improve their situation. And this also makes him a hero. Let me give you one example of that. One of Abarbanel's first actions was the redemption of Jewish slaves brought from North Africa to Portugal in 1471. During King Afonso V's capture of Azila in Morocco, a fortress on the Atlantic, that town's Jewish community, numbering 250, fell into the hands of the conquerors and were distributed as slaves among the Portuguese grandees. Since, of course, it's a commandment among Jews to redeem their brethren from the debasement of slavery, the Jewish community in Portugal organized for action, collected 10,000 gold pieces, and rescued and provided for the rehabilitation of these Jews in Portugal in their new homes. Abarbanel's treatment of these North African Jews, with whom he couldn't even converse, affords an example of his devotion to his people, as well as a manifestation of his strong will, his thoroughness, his sense of deep, almost personal responsibility for the welfare of those entrusted to his care. But let's find out a little bit more about him. Well, Don Isaac Abarbanel was the 15th century's greatest Jewish philosopher and humanist. He was born in Lisbon in 1437 into a distinguished family on account of their financial position as well as by their political achievements. The business undertakings of the Abarbanels was vast and ramified. They comprised tax farming, banking, large-scale imports from Flanders, and they called for constant vigilance and attention. During the years of 1478 to 81, the Abarbanel rises to the position of undisputed leadership in the Jewish community of Portugal, and his home becomes the center of intellectual discussions as well as the source of all major decisions concerning the community's affairs. This was the age of Fernán Lopez, known as the father of Portuguese history, whose historical works are commonly rated among the most artistic and inspiring chronicles of the Middle Ages. Abarbanel probably knew Lopez himself. So the languages here are Latin, Portuguese, Castilian, the three European languages in which clearly Isaac Abarbanel was well versed. It was in Hebrew that he must have received his basic education in all the subjects which formed his complex curriculum. For it is early in his life he manifested the command of Hebrew, which not only surprises us in its vivacity and beauty, but also indicates a thorough knowledge of all the phases of Hebrew literature. He also would have learnt Aristotle, Averroes, and Avicenna, the natural sciences, and astrology. None of the problems here with Aristotle, as we saw last week in Provence. Abarbanel was destined to be neither a physician nor an astrologer, but a theoretician and a writer. Our knowledge of Abarbanel's intimate life, to be sure, is quite incomplete. But we do know that he was married in early manhood, that he became, probably towards the end of 1470, the father of his first son, Judah, and within the next few years also the father of one or possibly two daughters. He had two more sons, Joseph, Joseph, and Shmuel, Samuel, all of whom were distinguished for their brilliance. And so Don Isaac Abarbanel enters the king's court. And indeed, Don Isaac is not the only Jew in the court. Influential also are the two Yahya brothers, Gedalia, who was Afonso's physician, and Joseph, who was a counselor of high rank. Abarbanel must have appealed to Afonso not only because of his various abilities, but also because of his intellectual honesty and vast erudition. For Afonso was, besides a patron of letters, a collector of books and a man of learning and keen intellect. All these elements are undoubtedly conducive to the development of an intimacy between the King Afonso and the Abarbanel that led the latter to feel for the king not only admiration but also affection. But again, it depends on the king and his attitudes towards the Jews, especially in the 15th century, when the church and the mendicant orders have a strong influence on Portuguese society. But Abarbanel quickly perceives the strength of the Duke of Braganza, the house from which the later kings of Portugal would come. The Duke commanded decisive influence with the king in the late 15th century and was the chief power in the administration. Let's just turn to the Braganza nobles for a second. This family consisted of the wealthiest nobles in the peninsula, and their possessions in land was enormous. We don't know what services the Abarbanel rendered in the management of their tremendous fiefs, but he must have fulfilled some vital tasks, for we know he was compensated in abundant measure. Abarbanel becomes the owner of vast estates, some of which came to him in all likelihood as gifts from his grateful and magnanimous friends. And it appears that even while in the king's service, Abarbanel continued to be in some form a functionary of the princes of Braganza. But when Afonso V died in August 1481, everything changes. Afonso dies unexpectedly of plague, and Abarbanel writes this moving eulogy about him in Hebrew. But the king's son, João II, is seen by Abarbanel as one of the worst tyrants ever to ascend the throne. João is angry because his father has left him penniless, having said to have handed out his funds to his nobles, and this is what he wrote: "All my father left me are the highways of Portugal." When Afonso dies, the Duke of Braganza was said to possess 50 towns and castles and about a third of the land of Portugal. João regards the family as usurpers of both royal wealth and power, and as the greatest obstacle to his absolutist ambitions. Their destruction becomes his first objective. Plus, strong anti-Jewish feeling now prevails in João's the court. A member of the powerful Yahya family, probably seeing the political trend, left the country in these days. But Abarbanel stays on and was to suffer not only because of his Jewishness, but also and primarily for his close association with the house of the Braganza. Abarbanel feels a plot is being hatched against the Jews of Portugal, and as their leader, he no doubt realizes that his downfall, if effected, might signal for them the beginning of the end. And when João complained that correspondence had been uncovered between the Duke of Braganza and a king in Aragon, the king begins to suspect Abarbanel as acting in the court in the capacity of the Duke's agent. Braganza is then arrested on May the 29th. Abarbanel realizes that escape is his only course. And on the night of the 31st of May 1483, he crosses the border into Spain, never to return. But before this time, for this terrible time for the Abarbanel, let's just think for a moment what works he had already written in Portugal. Well, the first becomes known as the form of the elements, Soot Hayasodot, which takes the theory attributed to the Greek philosopher Aristotle that everything on earth is composed of the four elements and basically explores their basic essence. And his second philosophical work that he writes in Portugal before he leaves is this, the Crown of Elders, or Ateretes Kainim, which bridges the young man's movement from philosophy to religion and eventually to mysticism, Kabbalah, and here he deals with the nature of God and prophecy, laying the foundations for his writing for the rest of his life. So perhaps it's not surprising that what he next does is goes to Spain and acts as this incredible diplomat. And look how here he is depicted in this famous moment in Spanish Jewish history when the king and queen of Spain are issuing the edict of expulsion in the Alhambra palace. Here Don Isaac takes the role of the chief defender of Spanish Jews, standing there with his back towards us in these beautiful robes, while an angry Torquemada, the chief inquisitor in Spain, throws his crucifix, saying, if you do not expel the Jews, you will be in trouble. After Spain, Abarbanel moves first to Naples and then finally, of course, to Venice, where he dies in 1508. The last words I want to share with you are the Abarbanel's description of his life in Portugal. This he shares in his book on biblical commentary. By the way, it's very common in writing at this time to use biblical quotes to back up your ideas. But let's ignore these references and get a sense of what he's saying. I lived peaceably as owner of my house, a house full of God's blessings in famous Lisbon, a city and a mother in the kingdom of Portugal. The Lord commanded there the blessings in my barns and all the earthly bliss. I built me houses and wide porches. My home became a place of meeting for the wise. I was happy in the court of the king. Don Afonso, a mighty king whose domain spread out and reached from sea to sea, prospering in whatever he did. A king who trusts in the Lord, fearing God and departing from evil, seeking the good of the Jewish people. When the heads of the people were gathered, under his shadow I delighted to sit. And when I was next to him, he leaned on my hand, and as long as he lived, I walked freely in the court. We sense his dedication to a king of Portugal who is no longer. I hope I've given you some sense as to the experience of Portuguese Jews in the medieval period. Their understanding of negotiation, of world affairs, really found them sought after by monarchs for delicate diplomacy. In many ways, our court Jews and the Arabi Moor held the community together. They were able to intercede, address the needs to the king, and often ask him to take the necessary steps in order to protect the community. We've witnessed the Jews living in a climate where the protection of the king ensured the internal autonomy of the Jewish communities and the physical existence of their members. And it is these sophisticated Jews of Portugal that tend to be forgotten with the forcible conversion of Jews in 1497 and the arrival of the Portuguese Inquisition in 1536. But they should be celebrated as defining a period in Jewish history that shows Jewish versatility and the Jews' ability to live in both societies successfully, the Jewish and that of the Christian. And how interesting, I think, that in 2019, in the Spanish-Portuguese Synagogue in New York, a reunion was organized by the descendants of the House of Braganza and the Ababa, as you see in this photograph. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kathy, for making Jewish life many, many years ago in beautiful places. You make it alive, and I think I'm speaking on behalf of your audience who've been writing in the chat how much this is appreciated. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you at future events here at the Bet Avichai Zoom from Jerusalem. Thank you.